He really consolidated like everything. No, he's super brilliant. It's true. I mean, and I'm giving him a hard time right now, but there's a lot of really good stuff in Ptolemy that, I love, and there's some meat to it. But I also found it to be like, I am so much more poetic, I think, naturally. So when I read this, I'm like trying to fit like the poetics of the cosmos into, like humors, the four humor. I mean, like so much of Ptolemy is based on that. Okay, so now I have the recording started, which is the main sort of concern. And now let me get this back up, and I'm going to show us a clip first. This is the very first thing that we'll do, because it's really awesome, and it gives, I think, a huge sort of like entrance into what we're doing here. So we'll just watch this for just probably not the whole 5 minutes, but I just want you guys to kind of zone into this for a minute. So Ptolemy was sort of like synonymous with the geocentric universe for however long. And so this is just this amazing, like really great animation of Ptolemy's sort of geocentric understanding of the cosmos, but with like modern technology. And you can kind of see, I don't know how well you can see in the dark, but one of the things that Ptolemy was really responsible for was creating these epicycles, which would account for the retrograde periods. So you can see the retrograde periods as these little dots, and the epicycles as these bigger sort of circles that kind of represent the orbit of the planet within its own bigger orbit around the Earth at the center, and the sun kind of on the outskirts between Venus and Mars. So I just find this to be so hypnotic and beautiful, and it's an entirely accurate representation of the geocentric perspective as well. So even though we know it's not accurate, like what's happening in the universe, I mean, this is what we see. This is exactly what we see from our perspective. Some of the things that I find like totally mesmerizing about this are Saturn. It's so slow on the outside. It's moving. If you see how slow it is compared to these like inner planets, I mean, like Mercury. Mercury is just going. You have the moon in there as well, sort of circling the Earth. Venus is kind of on her little journey, and then Saturn is just like this deliberate and slow sort of process. I find it to be so haunting and beautiful.
That's so
kind of, yeah. But the other thing that I think is really important to kind of imagine is like if you focus in on the background of this, you see none of that, right? All you see is like these sort of dots in the sky and this like nebulous sort of cloud of gas and whatnot. And like we have to kind of follow these patterns in order to see like all of this that's totally present and underlying it, and like what that kind of does to like the psyche, to the universe, to an individual once you kind of see this like inner order, like, in the midst of this seemingly like vast sort of dotted sky that doesn't really have much order on the surface. It's sort of like, bringing some sort of structure to our inner world by just recognizing what's over there. So responsible for ordering this chaos of astrology in the universe, and I felt like this was just such a like great like physical representation of that happening.
You've actually seen, witnessed the way that epicycles function.
Right. You hear about them.
Really beautiful. It's brilliant. Especially looking at Mars, that's just
Right.
The way just tracking how its epicycle is
Mhm.
rotating
Yeah. Yeah, I find it.
at a consistent rate and creates a pattern. It's just
Is yours the two low?
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is this the same as the appearances?
Yes,
That episode?
exactly. Yeah. That's what Ptolemy sort of was able to mathematically work out. A lot of that is laid out in the Almagest, which we'll get into in a second. So again, like that is such a, oh, I should make the thing stop. Hold on. So that's such a far cry from like, something like this where we're trying to, I mean, how does one like see that in this, aside from like literally centuries of tables kind of coming down to you and recognizing over periods of time that, what looks like this, that seems totally like chaotic and abstract is actually like a totally ordered sort of system. And, I think that it was, I wonder, like as we're here right now, we've got a sort of Saturn Neptune cycle that's happening in the sky, and you can kind of think about Ptolemy as sort of representing this like really sort of Saturnine structure from a very sort of Neptunian past of Babylonian like omens, and that kind of more sort of nebulous universe and cosmic structure that they had in the very sort of ancient prehistoric world. And then Ptolemy kind of comes in and is like this master sort of orchestrator and geometer, and like is able to kind of structure and put this sort of Saturnian sort of spin on things, I guess. Spin, I did not mean for that.
So what year was this?
So Ptolemy wrote in, I think he lived in like 150 to 200 AD. Or maybe it was 130 to like 190, something like that. So we're in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Ptolemy was he lived in Alexandria. He wrote in Greek, and then he was also a Roman citizen. So Rome, if you were a Roman citizen, you were an established sort of like reasonably respected of a certain sort of social class man in the ancient world, pretty much anywhere within the Roman Empire. So it could have been, as far east as what would be like Baghdad now, but then also like up into Italy and Rome, and then the whole sort of Mediterranean, Alexandria and whatnot. So Ptolemy lived in Alexandria, which would have had its own sort of collection of sort of historical sentiments and mysticism and religion and spirituality. But, again, he sort of wrote in Greek, which would have been the main language of the entire sort of Hellenistic era. And then he was a Roman citizen. So he was within this political sort of social structure of Rome, which at this point Christianity hadn't fully kind of taken over, but it was already percolating in the different areas of the empire. And then within 100 years, within a century, really 150 years, Christianity would be fully like legalized as the only reasonable religion. So Ptolemy was living in this total crux of time and space in the Hellenistic world. And so he wrote the Almagest, which is the sort of astronomical text that kind of discusses things like epicycles and the planets and the stars, kind of lays out like a very basic astronomical text, but it also lays out the geocentric universe that we saw in the video. And his text, the Almagest, went on to be like the primary astronomical text for like 15 centuries or so. I mean, like a ridiculous amount of time, basically until Copernicus. What this man wrote was how we thought that the universe worked, because it presented, as you can see, an incredibly beautiful, harmonious, reasonable, accurate answer from our perspective. So that also gives you a sense of like what Copernicus was doing too, to be able to take something that had existed for 15 centuries prior to him and turn it on its head. The fear and the sort of courage that would have been required for that is also sort of worthy of its own entire class logistically.
He also did music, right?
Ptolemy?
Yeah.
I believe so. I mean, Ptolemy did I actually don't know where I would find music theory in his work. He did the Tetrabiblos, and he wrote the geography, which is a sort of map. He wrote the handy tables, presumably. I don't know where music is, but I think that
there's some Ptolemy who's part of music tuning, like Greek music scales and stuff.
Oh,
I'm assuming it's the same guy.
yeah, it's entirely possible. It's not in the Tetrabiblos, or at least I didn't really find it, at least substantially. But so he wrote the Almagest. So he is like the foremost authority on like what the universe was supposed to be doing for the majority of, sort of like Western culture, in the way that we think of Western culture as our historical record, etc. And then he also wrote this book called the Tetrabiblos, which is the book that I've been sort of teaching through my Astrology's Great Books course. And it's a total astrological manual. So the Almagest is astronomical. It goes through like just the sort of scientific observations. And then the Tetrabiblos shows you how those observations and patterns reflect on a human being, an individual. And it's really sort of interesting. I think that a couple things that I find so fascinating about the Tetrabiblos is that it, just like the Almagest, has kind of come down to us as like the foremost astrological text. It's considered like, the starting point, what did you call it? A foundation text for any astrologer. And a lot of the main things that we think of when we think of astrology are in fact sort of contained in this book. It's one of the earliest texts that we have and that has survived as far as astrology goes. And so it definitely appears to be foundational, though the like completion of it and the amount that it sort of covers suggests that it's definitely a compilation of already totally extant sort of material that existed in his world. There's no way that he just like wrote this. Like this is stuff that's already been practiced, and he kind of took it all together and wrote this wonderful textbook of it. And I think that, again, when I kind of think of like my own personal work that I will always sort of project onto texts, just sort of my own personal disclaimer as a scholar, I really think that Ptolemy's sort of structuring of the cosmos had an effect on the structuring of the sort of intellect of the Western mind. And that is probably in part why it survived for so long, why it survived as a primary text for so long, and why it's so highly regarded, was that there's a combination of it being accessible. And so it was basically, we don't have any original Greek translations of it. The first one we have comes from about the 8th century, and it was in Arabic. So everything that we're reading of anything historically in the astrological tradition is a translation of a translation, often of a third translation. But Ptolemy is a very early source that we have, and we have paraphrases of him and other authors like Proclus from the 5th century, who kind of gave a more accessible, sort of entertaining introduction to or paraphrase of the Tetrabiblos, and he was about the 5th century. So there's this sort of tradition and lineage of this particular book that kind of brings us across the world and also through the intellectual history of Western thought, really, because we start in Greece and then we have to sort of escape Greece because Christianity kind of smushes out any thinking that doesn't have to do with sort of biblical religiosity, monotheism. And so then all of the thinking and science and natural philosophies and alchemy have to move to the Middle East, where they get then translated and preserved. And then from there, they get moved in the Middle Ages to the churches in Europe, and then they preserve them and translate them into Latin and back into Greek. There are copies of the Tetrabiblos that were translated from the Arabic back into Greek. So there's this whole sort of textual tradition, but I think that the reason why the Tetrabiblos was preserved was, number one, because it was such a compendium of information, but also because it served this really real purpose in ordering this seemingly unordered sort of universe in which we live. And that had an effect on the psyche of the average sort of person or intellectual, which would have been elite at the time. And so it's a really sort of critical text in that sense that not only is it like the primary foundational sort of astrological textbook, but it is also that for a reason. And so then what are those reasons that people kind of latched onto this particular book? What did it provide that, say, Rhetorius, which we're going to read next, didn't, or that Valens didn't? And so that's why I kind of wanted to look at the Tetrabiblos and really kind of dive into it as deeply as I could. So I'm trying to follow along on my notes sort of loosely. Okay, so I went through a brief historical overview. So then one of the things that's really interesting, so then the structure of the Tetrabiblos is such that the very first book kind of goes into the philosophy of like what, and I gave a lecture on that previously. It's online if you guys like totally want it. I'll send you links for sure. In that I kind of discuss a lot of the content. The first book is really a philosophical basis for astrology. And in it, Ptolemy is really sort of, he's so pragmatic and like, he reminds me of like being with your favorite teacher who says, I'm going to teach you everything, and there are so many ways in which this could go wrong, and there are so many ways in which you are going to fail because the cosmos is vast and you can't possibly understand it in its entirety, but still, this is the teaching that I'm giving to you, you know, and all of this is in his first book. But then he also discusses sort of the logistical Aristotelian universe in which astrology could work. So it's not that it doesn't work, it's that humans are fallible in their ability to interpret all of the different layers. But so the first book kind of goes into this, a lot of the humors and breaking down each of the constellations and the planets based on their humoral sort of characteristics, which then can translate into plants, nations, people, which then sets the ground for this sort of like cosmic sympathy, which again would have been something that was kind of contemporary to Ptolemy, especially being from Alexandria, where you have things like Hermeticism sort of starting to be written and rising, early sort of beginnings of magic, and then also really kind of steeped in a Neoplatonic tradition where everything is sort of connected and part of this sort of like greater living universe. So Ptolemy is fully steeped in all of that, even if the Almagest is a very dry sort of scientific astronomical text, and even if the Tetrabiblos doesn't really give much to myth or sort of like poetic justice, there's still all of that definitely underneath and in the philosophical sort of structure of what he's writing. Yeah.
Would you say it's Pythagorean?
Absolutely. I think that that's a huge, well, I think it would be impossible to separate any astrologer ever from Pythagoras. I mean, I think that what he created as far as understanding the sort of geometry of the universe and insisting that there is a sort of mathematical purity, I think that so much of astrology is rooted in that. However much it's willing to recognize it, or however much it's sort of like talked about, I think that the foundations of Pythagoras's philosophy and way of life are totally critical to any astrology, like pretty much at all. That I would feel comfortable saying that, and that's kind of a big statement. But so yeah, I think definitely that's part of it. There's this sort of lineage of structuring the universe, believing it's divine, structuring the universe, believing it's divine, and I think all of those things kind of come into play when you're looking at anything that has to do with astrology, or at least should be, and I think that when we see a breakdown in that kind of in the modern era is when we also kind of see a breakdown in maybe the efficacy or the respectability of astrology too. So I think those are critical parts for sure. So when we talk about this sort of philosophy of Ptolemy, we're definitely looking at like an Aristotelian cosmos where everything is kind of categorized. So I think that, and I again, so I don't want to go into this too much because I already did this particular lecture, but I think that one thing that I kind of like thinking about with Plato and Aristotle is sort of like Plato as above, like the above and below, as above, so below, and Aristotle as below. And so they're sort of part of this same pole, but Plato focuses on this realm of ideal forms, whereas Aristotle is a little bit more in the here and now. And so Ptolemy really is sort of an Aristotelian answer to an astrology that would have been more Platonic prior to him, that was more in the sense like of sort of soul salvation, and also kind of like understanding like the world above and trying to recreate that perfection in a human life. And I think Tetrabiblos and Ptolemy really kind of shies from that and is just looking at the didactic, practical, how do these things manifest in a human life and what does that mean, without so much of the pretense of how do we mirror the above. It's more like how does the above relate to what we're doing here and now, which makes it really kind of cool because then you're sort of bringing it back down into earth, and it's really easy as astrologers, I think, to get totally caught up in the heavens, right? So Ptolemy served a really important purpose in kind of grounding everything. So, but then also in addition, you know, we're in Hellenistic era, we're in Alexandria, that we're by no means like monophilosophical at all. There's so many different kind of currents that are all kind of converging in this particular era. And so Aristotelianism would have been one of them, but there's also, like I said, those sort of those undercurrents of Hermeticism. The Corpus Hermeticum is dated to about the same time as Ptolemy, and Ptolemy could have actually been recognized, like Nick Campion, in his book, The Dawn of Astrology, talks about how the Tetrabiblos could easily have been considered like a practical workbook for the kind of philosophical, spiritual sort of musings of the Corpus Hermeticum, and they're contemporary with each other. And so you can kind of think of it as like this full course, you know, in like spiritual sort of soul salvation or whatever, how to live right, but then also how to kind of understand the sort of cosmic world in which we live. And then we also have, though, on top of everything, too, this very, which has been with astrology from the beginning, would be the sort of Stoic sort of philosophy as well, as a kind of background narrative to everything that has to do with astrology. And so we're kind of like, we have all of these layers all kind of coming in through here. And I think that that's one of the really potentially also another reason why Ptolemy's text was able to kind of go through so many centuries and still be respected, is because it's neutral in its teachings. But it also kind of carries these philosophical underpinnings. It was able to sort of adapt, I think, to different cultures and to different teachings, and it could fit within an entirely different culture than the one in which it was created. And in some ways, it sort of carried these secret undertones of Hermeticism and Stoicism and Aristotelian universe. They were all contained within it, but it's not blatant at all. I mean, we'll read some of it, and it's just, you know, you have to kind of understand that when he says, you know, that this particular part of the globe is ruled by this planet, and therefore those people are angry, you know, like that's all he's saying. But what you're getting inside of that is this sort of humoral balance in which everything is cosmically sympathetic, but then also everything kind of cosmically tries to balance to each other. And I think that that's an important thing that comes across a little bit more in Ptolemy than maybe in Aristotle in general, is just that everything sort of seeks this balance. That comes again from sort of like Hippocrates, really, of just that there are sort of four major kind of groups, but that they try their best to kind of regulate themselves and always kind of come to a certain sort of balance. And so although it's not your like Platonic cosmic sympathy in like this poetic sense of everything relating to each other, there's this new level of things that are out of balance, always seeking to return to a balance in their individual sort of categories. So that's one of the things that I think is really kind of present in Ptolemy. And so that's kind of what we get through in book 1 of the Tetrabiblos. But then in book 2 and 3 is where we get kind of the chunk of his astrological teachings, what he believes. And it is dense, and it's a really kind of complicated work. There's a lot of like, I don't know what the word is, of just like intricate sort of calculating, and I'll read into it a little bit. But so book 2, he kind of goes into mundane astrology. Book 3, he goes into more of a personal birth chart reading. And that's when a lot of this sort of stoicism and this idea that we are fated, and that there is a full fate. I mean, and that makes sense because within that sort of universe in which we have, you know, sort of different pieces that are always striving for harmony and balance, everything kind of has to be always fated, because that's how it's always returning to some sort of equilibrium. So all of that is kind of present in his astrology, but he always leaves the opportunity and the open-ended possibility that we can do something about it. So Stoicism always kind of has that balance of like, we are totally fated, but somehow free will kind of figures into this, and there's some sense of freedom in the whole story. And you kind of see that because he goes through such great effort to teach us how to kind of understand our fate. And again, the presumption is that something can be done about it, which I would argue, and I don't have any sort of sources, or, you know, definitely not within the text itself, I would argue, and one of my great beliefs in all of my life is that this was never meant to stand alone, and that it would have always been part of a practic or a sort of praxis in which things like magic, things like actual kind of integrating one's star chart or, you know, the star chart of the moment or the country in which you live with some sort of practical earthly practices and daily kind of rituals or whatever would have helped to kind of align yourself in an easier way or something along those lines. So again, I don't have anything, I don't have any like scholastic evidence to support that yet, but that's sort of what I'm working on with everything. So, so again, Tetrabiblos is really a kind of like, if you could imagine just like a fully shaved down container for a whole lot more information than it even begins to kind of provide for us. So I want to sort of show a couple of images real quick, just to kind of really kind of go into, why is this doing that? Just to kind of drill this idea that I have. Oh no, that's the same one. Hold on, sorry. I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna have to just draw it. So, hold on. Okay. Go up. Okay, so if you can kind of like imagine with me and go back to that place we were just in with that kind of like vast picture of space and these sort of like, I don't know, dots in the sky that, you know, it's at some point in very early human history we realized were in fact sort of balls of fire, right? Like thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away. I think that's all available. I don't want to close that because I'm recording and I just turn it off. There we go. So then at some point you start to kind of like understand that these sort of dots in the sky have, you know, perhaps like some sort of structured image behind them. Hold on. It's actually really hard to draw the constellations. I've decided that I'm like making it a point. I should be able to draw each of the zodiac constellations as though they were a letter that I was totally familiar with. So I'm like trying to practice drawing them. So this is what we sort of think of, right? We have like the vastness of space with a couple of lights, but each of these lights has a million lights behind it. And so it's, I mean, it's really hard to kind of like just determine some sort of structure. So then we imagine that there's some sort of form behind there. And then at some point, right, it turns into, and I'm like the worst sort of artist in the universe, but at some point it turns into, you know, like a sort of scorpion with his tail and his body and all of that stuff. And what I kind of, you know, so what do we have? We have space, and then we have specific stars, and then we have lines, and then from those lines we flesh out like this beautiful sort of image, right, of like this artsy scorpion, like if you can picture those like Middle Ages and Renaissance sort of art renderings of each of the constellations. But I think that it's potentially maybe the other way around, was what I would argue is that you would have to be able to see the scorpion first, right, before you could get to the lines. There's no way you're going to go from a couple of lines randomly to a fully fleshed out image. Like somehow that image of a Scorpio has to scorpion has to be there initially. And so then the image and the mythology and the story and the art has to kind of but without these simple lines, like the constellation of Scorpio couldn't really exist. You have to see the entire image before you can kind of pare it down. And so I think that, you know, Ptolemy really sort of carries that sense of, we've already established that these stories exist. We've already established that there's some sort of imagistic, like imaginal realm up in the cosmos. And now we can kind of like shake it down and bring it into this like really kind of basic dot to dot, connect the dots sort of, and then go from there. And what Ptolemy does at the end of book one is he even kind of takes this a little bit further. And he starts to kind of like assign planetary associations to each of the stars within each of the constellations. And so not only is a constellation like this sort of imaginal image, sorry for that. Not only is it, you know, this sort of artistic rendering of like the human imagination, but then it's also pared down to be just a sort of linear representation. And then furthermore, each of these points within it can correspond to some really bigger, greater sort of planetary archetype. And like how fascinating that is. And if any of you are familiar with the constellations, this star is Antares, which appears in the sky as a pretty red star. And so of course he associates it with Mars. And so much of what Ptolemy does is very observation based. He doesn't really, like none of his, with respect to a couple of different parts within book 2, towards the end of book 2, nothing he says is not without a reason and an excuse within a sort of observationally based, categorized Aristotelian perspective. So this is a red star, obviously it's ruled by Mars. It's a bright star, so obviously Jupiter is a secondary ruler. I mean, just like as basic as you could possibly go. And in some ways it becomes incredibly like limiting in its structure, but then it also helps you kind of dilute into this really archetypal influence, like red Mars, you know, like bright Jupiter, like very simple. You don't have to get too complicated. And so you're kind of distilling into these archetypes while at the same time sort of super delineating in these really like structured, logical ways.
He's also showing you his magical method.
Right.
That's how he thinks, and that's how you can apply that to anything.
Right. And can you say more? I would love to hear more about like where you're going with that. But I totally agree, but would you expand?
Let's see. Well, like I said, essentially you can apply it to anything.
Right,
So
yeah.
Once you understand that redness and fire have to do with Mars,
Mhm.
if you're walking down the street, you see a fire on your right,
Yeah.
that might mean that there's like, Mars will be on the ascendant.
Mhm.
Watch out for Mars on the ascendant.
Right.
So that's a kind of poetic thing,
Mhm.
even though he's presenting the information in a kind of dry way.
Yes,
He's kind
exactly.
of trying to train you in this kind of analogical,
Right.
poetic, cosmic thing.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think that that's such a great perspective to take with something like Ptolemy is, you know, when you learn, you know, when any of us was a kindergartner, right, we learned that. And like, that's not really poetic, right? It's A is for apple. And then eventually you get like your image, right? You have your apple and you have your like soccer ball or whatever, and you have like your cat. And so you get these sort of images. I mean, it's really just like learning a language. But then once you really get these, you get like Shel Silverstein. And you're still little, but you have these wonderful poems that you can kind of understand based on these really like basic, bare bones sort of letters, then images, and then you can kind of open up a whole poetic world. And I definitely feel like that's the strength in Ptolemy, is it's very much like an alphabetic kind of approach to astrology. So
he's not asking you to believe him. He's just saying, this is how things are.
Not only is he not asking you to believe him, but then, I mean, in so many parts, here, let's see if I can read a quick section for you from the very beginning. I think it's actually the very first lines. Hold on. Yeah, so I'll read to you guys the first sort of section of, and this is again a kind of outdated, abstruse sort of translation, so bear with me. But he says, the first mentioned study has already been explained in the syntaxis. The syntaxis is what he called the Almagest, to the utmost practicable extent, for it is complete in itself and of essential utility even without being blended with the second, namely the Tetrabiblos. So that's what this treatise is going to be devoted to. The present work shall, however, be regulated by that due regard for truth which philosophy demands. And since the material quality of the objects acted upon renders them weak and variable and difficult to be accurately apprehended, no positive or infallible rules, as were given in the first doctrine, can here be set forth. While on the other hand, a due observation of most of those general events which evidently trace their causes to the ambient shall not be omitted. So this is the second paragraph of his tetrabiblos. And he's already telling you that while in the Almagest, you can kind of count on everything that I said because they adhere to these laws. Once you get into the realm of humans and, you know, the sort of sublunar realm where everything is chaos and imperfect, like nothing is exactly as it seems. They're not infallible. And so he's already kind of inviting you to take what he's saying and use it in a broader sense than just sort of as a formula for an answer. And I think that I love that he kind of sort of starts with that. I think that it's really important. I know that Rick Tarnas had always talked about carrying the pole of doubt as an author. Like, you have to be willing to admit your defeat in the beginning, otherwise other people are going to be able to attack your work. And so Ptolemy absolutely sort of carries that. So then another sort of image, and then I'm going to read a bit just to kind of get us into the second book. So hold on, let me get this up here.
You could use that black thing hanging out.
As the center, right?
Yeah.
What am I doing? Oh, there it is. Okay. Okay. So I'll just kind of refer to that, but from here. So I'm going to read. So then, the introduction to book one, he discusses. You know, I can't give you any infallible rules here because there's so much changeability in the things that we are now talking about. We've left the heavens, which are perfect and reliable, and we've entered Earth, which is just a mess. And so this is the best we can kind of do. It's really what he's saying. So then, the introduction to book two. Hold on, let me see where I want to start. Okay, so he says, the great and leading points requiring to be attended to as a necessary means of introduction to the consideration of predictions, having been succinctly defined, the further parts of the subject, like comprehending everything which may tend to facilitate prediction and render it complete, shall now be duly proceeded in. And at the same time, care shall be taken to confine the whole doctrine within the limits of natural reason. So we have natural reason as like the bigger sort of structure. Nothing can exist. No prediction can happen if it's outside of that realm of natural reason. And that is really critical. That's where Aristotle comes in, and that's where Ptolemy, you know, and this is potentially one of the linchpins in his philosophy as well, is that what Ptolemy sought to do was to shed astrology of that sort of mythic, supernatural kind of qualities. He was coming from Stoicism. People like Cicero were already attacking astrology. I mean, it was already a mixed bag of whether or not people thought it was reasonable to think that the stars influenced. I mean, all the way back then, it was already a question whether or not this was a reality. And so his idea was to sort of set it within this container of natural reason. But what that ended up doing 15 centuries later was limit astrology to natural reason. And once natural reason no longer lined up with what he believed the universe to look like, what he believed was natural reason, his system kind of imploded. And that's sort of what was, I would say, a large part, the demise of astrology. So while his influence in kind of focusing on the natural world and natural reason was critical in helping it to sort of preserve for so long, it also definitely contributed to it kind of falling apart in the long run. But so again, very first thing is natural reason. Nothing can exist without that. And then in book one, he discusses your sort of larger humors. Venus will always be sort of fertile, moist, and warm. And so Venus is not going to be cold. And so within that, you have to kind of sit. So all of those sort of natural inherent characteristics of the planets and the constellations would be the next center. And then what we're about to talk about in book two, that's in the very center. So like, not only are we dealing with changing bodies and with the sublunar realm, which is totally imperfect, but we also have all of these other layers before we can even get to the content that we're going to talk about. So even though I might have, you know, let's say Jupiter on the ascendant in sort of a lean fire sign, maybe Sagittarius or something, If I did not come from the far north, I will never be tall, like there's natural reason, that has to do with like your actual physicality and the geocentricity of where you, or like the actual geolocation of your sort of where you inhabit. But then you also have like this sort of natural, like I have Jupiter there. And so it's just, you're working with lens upon lens upon lens, and it limits, but also kind of, helps to structure.
Diagnosis.
Exactly. Yeah. It structures your diagnosis. It gives you exactly, and that's really all sort of modern medicine is crossing off symptoms. Right. And so that's kind of what Ptolemy is sort of teaching us to do. So in chapter 2, or in the second book, hold on, there's a couple pieces I wanted to read from it. So he sort of goes through and discusses, he associates each part of the globe of his time, which I had a photo of, but I don't think it made the transition to this particular computer, and I've already turned that down. But there's this wonderful sort of chart that discusses each of the signs of the zodiac. You guys can kind of see it ever so briefly. And so it's each of the signs of the zodiac, which triplicity or sort of quadrant of the compass it relates to, and then each of the countries that are ruled by it. And so, in Ptolemy's world, basically, if you could kind of understand the underlying sort of humoral characteristics of each of the particular planets and zodiac signs, and then memorize their associations with different parts of the world, then you would be able to understand and predict based on current astrological phenomena like eclipses or sort of stations of certain planets. You would be able to understand what was going to happen in any part of the world at any given time. That's the kind of stuff. This is where I have to put on the brakes personally, because I was so tempted to sort of look at the supermoon chart and see any sort of, to what extent any of his opportunities for prediction kind of come across. But personally, I don't like doing that. It's not my style of astrology, but just if anybody wants to do it, you could probably do that, and I'm sure there would be correlations. But it's the sort of thing that makes me uncomfortable personally on a philosophical level, so I don't even bother with it. Because I would rather not. I would rather. With foreknowledge as well. And then for me and my particular Scorpio stellium, I become obsessive, and then I can't possibly understand or be willing to engage in anything unless I am sort of prepared for it astrologically, and then that's no way to live, for me personally.
I think he shows you a way out of that by letting you know just how to think about it and not getting all wrapped up in the detail.
Well, certainly that's so much easier said than lived, right? It's one thing to have somebody tell you that. It's another thing to be able to practice it in a daily sort of experience of life. And for me, I can't turn it off. So I have to kind of not even go there really. And I sort of have to look at it from a very objective perspective.
Like you're afraid that astrology will kind of englobe you.
I know it does. It's not a fear of potential. It's an experience of it having done so,
So are you englobed in a Ptolemaic or a Copernican?
Neither. I would say it's definitely, there's no outlets around here. Okay. They're on the other side of the room. Hold on.
We could all move.
No, it's totally fine. I actually don't need this anymore. Let me just move this over real quick, and then I can kind of keep talking and just get it plugged in down here.
Do you know about theurgy?
Hold on, sorry. All right, there we go. They're all plugged in and still ready to go. Yes, I'm familiar with the concept, but
So it's just ritual, the philosophers, Neoplatonism, right? Theurgy.
Right.
And doing rituals.
Yes.
as like what philosophy is about.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that's kind of like, and we don't really know what they did.
Right.
But it sounds like it's the missing part that you were talking about with him.
Definitely, and I
That there
think
was this whole activity going on.
yeah, and I think that probably that seems to be in my own, sort of personally, regardless of any of the fact that we're in class right now, like just as a sort of discussion, I feel so much the presence of that missing, and that is where I get caught up, and so it's like, okay, so then what? Like, great, now we know this, now you've given us every possible tool to understand what's gonna happen, so what, and I know that the so what is missing from the tradition in our sort of historical context, and that frustrates me, I think, so I don't even
Well,
bother.
like Jung's famous line about that, isn't it something like the missing gods become illnesses?
The missing gods become
So
illnesses?
it's not exactly that,
Right.
but it's something like that.
Yeah, well, and
You know,
that definitely,
Yeah, it's something like that, but it's like somehow like, oh, that whole missing thing becomes modern madness in a way.
right.
It's that quote about the gods have fallen from the sky, so now they show up in our psyches as symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, something
Yes,
like that.
yeah. I think that's exactly what it was, and that's totally, yeah, and that was something that I, in the first lecture on Ptolemy, really it became so obvious that there were a couple things that have been missing from the astrological tradition that we really, like the sense of observation that he carries within it is totally gone now. Now we don't even look at the stars anymore. Like we look at our phone now, or an ephemeris 20 years ago, and then we imagine, sort of the stars and the planets and the cycles. We can't even see them, exactly. We don't look, we can't see. So we've totally taken this to a different perspective, but from his world, it was entirely observational. And so nothing could have been excluded from that. I mean, the power and the presence of the cosmos when 2,000 years ago was just something I don't think we can even begin to comprehend. Like maybe some of us have had glimpses of it if we've spent extended time outdoors, away from urban environments, without technology. But as astrologers, I mean, I learned how to calculate a chart from scratch without a computer. But even still, technology has assisted my astrology from the very beginning.
Or I feel like to some degree that the observational things you're talking about, like looking at stars and recognizing patterns, has to do with something that's even deeper than that.
Right.
So when you look and find a scorpion in the sky, it's because that part of the sky has something to do with what we think of as scorpions,
Right.
or whatever, phoenixes, or.
I think that there must absolutely be some sort of relation.
So in other words, it's not only observation; it's sort of like deep intuition.
Deep intuition, or what would be called now participation, and that there is a message and a receiver for that message, and that it's a sort of joint kind of coming together to understand these things.
And they come together as the constellation.
Yeah, it's like an interface, if you could imagine, so like the screen.
So like for example.
I mean, because what's on the other side of that screen is like a million megapixels and lights and weird shit, but somehow I can see like an image, but it's set to my eye, and I think that the constellations in the heavenly sphere would be a very similar sort of metaphor, because what's behind the heavenly sphere is about a million images and lights and whatnot.
But we tend to reduce it to 12 or 36 or whatever.
Yeah.
So for some reason, we like that number. But I don't know if that has anything to do with outer space itself.
No, it doesn't. It would have to do with the geocentric experience of outer space, and the passage of the sun through, the sort of ecliptic, and so the numerical definitely has validity for sure, and those numbers are not random at all. But from an external perspective, they might not make much sense. But from Earth, it really is this like wonderfully ordered, like neat kind of universe, and it's sort of cool to be a part of that. Okay, so sort of diving a little bit more into book 2 as we're at 8:30. I've stranded you guys here for an hour already just chatting. So in his sort of like practice of mundane astrology, let me put these up there. So I guess, what's really interesting, and you two were in class with me, Travis and Sam, a little bit ago, and we can kind of see like if we think of what Rick was talking about and kind of focus on like the axial as this sort of like coming to consciousness of like the historical sort of time, right? So then Ptolemy is really kind of jumping in on that sort of bandwagon, I guess, and really kind of focusing on history. So the whole of book 2 is on mundane astrology, and he kind of gives like mundane being like of the world, I guess is the right way to talk about it, mundos, world. So his instructions are to look at your sympathies right off the bat. So the very first thing you would kind of search for is, given any sort of major astrological phenomena like an eclipse, you would try and understand what zodiac signs it was happening in, and then find the countries that are sympathetic with that particular, with those particular signs. And then from there, you would kind of look at the foundation chart of a city. So you're like, oh, okay. And again, I'm not doing this at all, but like we could say like, oh, well, the last sort of like, the last supermoon was in Libra, right? So then we would kind of look and try and figure out like, what are the countries that are ruled by Libra?
Maybe
Okay.
start.
What was that?
Don't start.
I know, no. Okay, so then there's all of these particular countries. Okay, so then now we're gonna kind of go a layer further and like, let's see if we can find out where the foundation chart of that city is, because back in that time, they did things like create charts for the moments that, or at least time it for the moment that a city was sort of founded. So then they would do a foundation chart. And then if that didn't exist, they would kind of look at the chart of the ruler. So if there's a king, president, dictator, whatever it happens to be, then they would sort of look there. And then all of this would kind of fall into the realm of his primary kind of prediction technique, at least in regards to mundane astrology, is eclipses. They were of utmost importance to him. And I think that I wanted to just sort of, I'll read the quick section. He says, so the strongest and principal cause of all these events exists in the ecliptical conjunctions, which is the eclipse of the sun and the moon, and in the several transits made by the planets during these conjunctions. One part of the observations required informing predictions in cases of this nature relates to the locality of the event and points out the cities or the countries that are liable to be influenced by the eclipses, or by the occasional continued stations of those planets. And he says that the planets that you're looking for are Saturn, Jupiter, Mars. And then he says another branch of this relates to the time and gives pre-information of the period at which the event will occur and how long it will kind of continue to operate. Then he goes on to discuss that there's also this generic sort of classes thing, and like what classes will it affect? Animal life, will it affect sort of peasants, will it affect rulers? And that you can tell all of this just from the sort of eclipse chart of any given eclipse. And then he also says the last part is more specific and foreshows the actual quality and character of the coming event. So depending on the planets, it could be disastrous, it could be plague, it could be sort of drought, things like that. And so so the fact that I think is really interesting in regards to my sort of broader perspective and the work that I'm doing with my dissertation and my beliefs in the history of astrology, the fact that he starts his mundane astrology, which is the first real chunk of astrology he offers us in his compendium, his textbook of astrology, that he's looking at the ecliptical conjunctions of the sun and the moon, which are the eclipses. To me, I find that really interesting because it lays out, again, this further sort of structuring of the cosmos as a spherical, cyclical system, which prior to the Hellenistic era was not the case. In Babylon, where we have the most sort of flourishing astrology, it wasn't spherical, it wasn't a circle, it didn't have repeatable cycles. It really wasn't until we get into Hellenistic astrology that we come to understand it as a cycle, and that he is not only the person who cycled that for us, but then, or that laid out and sort of outlined the fact that it's a cycle, but then that he also goes in to use those cycles as absolute keys for how to even understand the relationship between above and below, between humans and the stars, is I think really interesting and really telling of the importance of structuring something that seems unstructured and what we can learn from that. Human life seems unstructured, so look for the cycles. The cosmos seems unstructured, so create epicycles, like figure out a way to kind of bring this order or save these appearances, because underneath everything there is some sort of like inherent divine harmony. And so that's already apparent in his sort of mundane approach to learning about the world.
So did he see the eclipse as being a moment of great harmony or great disharmony?
Officially speaking, he doesn't say. It can go any way depending on the characteristics of the signs involved, depending on the characteristics of the planets involved. Anything can be mitigated by anything else, and that was the interesting thing, and that's where this sort of Aristotelian like effort and striving towards balance comes in, is that in all of the things that he describes, he'll say, and this, I actually believe that I have an exact quote of it that I would like to read, because he says it better than I do. Okay, yeah. So this is him sort of discussing, he goes into the planets, and his description of the planets is so beautiful, but also incredibly archetypal, and really kind of sets the stage for even now how we still understand the planets. But in his preface to going into describing what happens with each of the planets, he says this: in order to understand the indications thus made, it is necessary to begin by attending to the following detail of the effective property of each planet. Previously observing, however, that when any circumstance is said, for the sake of brevity, to come to pass by the general influence of the 5 planets, their temperament, and the power and assistance they may derive from natures similar to their own, the actual continuance of their own proper constitution, or the casual combination of any analogous influence arising from fixed stars or places in the zodiac, are all at the same time to be kept in view. Consequently, whenever any general remark is herein made relative to the 5 planets, it will be necessary to bear in mind their temperament and quality, as fully indeed as if the stars themselves had not been named. So he's really kind of struggling to express that the planets have to be considered in relation to the overlay and everything that surrounds them, and the stars that are next to them, and the constellations in which they're found. But you also have to think of them alone, and that their entire sort of integrity and their individual nature will never fully change. And so it is further to be remembered that in every case of compound temperament, not only the combination of the planets with each other requires to be considered. So if you put Moon and Venus together, you have to think both Moon and Venus, but also that of the fixed stars. So then you also have to layer on in Scorpio or whatever, by being sort of respectively connected with them and their familiarity. So basically, he really does kind of give us this sense of like, there's so many different flavors, and you have to kind of draw them out, but then they also kind of get all smushed together. And then he goes on into his wonderful sort of explanation of each of the planets, and he's, when Saturn happens, like, there's going to be evil and grief and death will be frequent, and this is like such a horrible, men will suffer, they will be destroyed by disease. And then he goes to Jupiter, and he's like, and if Jupiter is the lord of this sort of eclipse chart among mankind, this planet promotes honor, happiness, content, and peace. With regard to the constitution of the atmosphere will be healthy and temperate. It will be filled with gentle breezes and moisture. And then Mars alone, when governing, generally causes mischief and destruction. All of these are very common. We think of Jupiter as like big and expansive and benefic or good, and then we think of Saturn as sort of restraining and potentially like complicated. And all of that is fully present in Ptolemy, even though he's really taking it from a very like practical, mundane perspective, which I think is interesting. And this would be one of the earliest sources we have that gives a planet and a description of that planet. And it's in this context of a sort of meteorological, almost like very sort of naturally philosophical explanation. And I think that that's interesting to just sort of pay attention to the fact that it always came, or at least astrology really came in with a hugely global perspective in mind from the beginning. It didn't initially kind of go to an individual. It was initially really kind of like looking at a broader, and that goes all the way back to sort of your Babylonian early like astral omens, is that they were very much related to the earth and to like the actual logistics of living on a planet. And perhaps there's some sort of wisdom in that for us as we move forward through this awesome time that we're all getting to be a part of. Okay, bye. So thing that he says, so not only do we have your mundane astrology, we've got your basic sympathies that we would look at. You go to your foundational charts, and then you also kind of look at the chart of a ruler of a kingdom. But then he also has this part in book 2 and chapter 9 where he suggests all of these general affections of whatever kind, whether good or evil, will be principally felt by those persons in whose individual nativities there may be found the same disposition of the luminaries. And so now we finally get the people in, like individual human beings are somehow related into this sort of broad, mundane, global perspective if they have sort of matching charts to like the particular configurations of the sun and the moon. And I think that that's so wonderful that you can be kind of drawn in as an individual human being to this huge like global sort of perspective just by virtue of the placement of the stars when you were born. And so this is, I think, a really critical part in the Tetrabiblos overall is just, so not only do we have natural reason, and then we have, you know, like your sort of general humoral kind of basic sympathies, and then not only do you have your mundane sort of interpretations, but then somewhere all the way within there is like an individual, you know, and it's sort of connected to this whole bigger drama.
But the Greeks had oracles, for example, so you could connect up as an individual
Right.
with the big.
Yeah, and you could matter. I think that that's a really important sort of key point is that you could matter. Like, why would an individual matter just because it happens to have that? But that this was something that was happening in the larger sort of philosophy of the time, as we see in sort of axial kind of like growing. But then also, you know, within the astrology as well. And this kind of gives the entire basis of what would go on to be like birth chart astrology, what we all sort of know and love at this point. Sort of like the seed of it is really just right here that we're subject to all of this, but we also have a special relationship to it.
So he cosmicized the ego.
Yes, I think so. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Well, and so we're not going to have time to get into book 3 tonight, but in book 3 he goes into, you know, sort of like the soul, really, you know, and like how that kind of comes out, and it would be like the very sort of most primitive form of like psychological astrology sort of comes across in that that next sort of chunk of this book.
Does he divide up the soul into certain parts?
Yep. But hold on, I don't want to go there yet. So, okay, so we've gotten all of that. So then he closes book 2 with what he calls the new moon of the year. And so, and basically the remaining pages are just this like meteorological, like, you know, if the new moon that happens before this Aries ingress of any given year, you know, if the moon is in this sign and these planets are in this sign, then you're going to have good weather. Then you're going to have rain. Then you're going to have pestilence on all of your crops. And then he just goes into this great, like, sort of meteorological exposition, which is really interesting.
So it's like the Farmer's Almanac.
Totally Farmer's Almanac seeds right here back in 150 AD. And again, all the while, like really maintaining this full 100% commitment to this observational, rational, detached, sort of logical basis in these sort of humors and basic characteristics, and then how those kind of play out.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, a really critical kind of thing to kind of like, if I could say that over and over and over again, to just understand that, you know, like, sure, Scorpio has its own set of significations as a whole, but it also has like within it, like, you know, you're sort of cold and dry, and then it also has like your sort of hot and moist, and each of those things really kind of drive the constellation forward in a way that, you know, you're not going to get if you just look at it as a whole picture. That you have to understand that within each whole picture are little components, and each of those components sort of you know, give their own kind of quality, but then also sort of seek to be balanced within that quality.
So he wanted us to be as constant as the cosmos itself.
He wanted what to be?
Us
Us.
as individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I would say.
Maybe he was trying to train us to just be with it, because that's part of the magic. That
Yeah.
Maybe he didn't articulate, is that we have to, the cosmos beyond natural reason is just sort of humming along in some grand scale.
Yeah.
So we have to be, through observation,
Mhm.
to be an observer, you have to be semi-normal. I mean, in other words, you have to almost become a normal person to say, yes, that's a table.
Right,
I'm not gonna freak out and say that's not a table.
Right.
And that'll screw up all my observations.
yeah,
So
yeah,
he's demanding constancy,
he is,
as
yeah.
science does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he was, he was the first like scientist in the sense that any of us would recognize it, and his science works like carried on for hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards because of that real kind of presence. And that's, why I wanted to kind of teach this course in general, and why I did pick Ptolemy, even though I'm regretting it now, is just like without him, we would have so little, I mean, and the average sort of textbook of the history of science doesn't really go in, at least to the extent that it's necessary. It doesn't really like give him his just due, you'll kind of maybe look into the Almagest, but to take the Almagest separate from the Tetrabiblos and to not understand that those two things made Ptolemy the man is just such a disservice
He was also a geographer.
to history, and he was also a geographer. Absolutely, I had a map of his that, and I mean his contribution to creating sort of the Western intellectual tradition is unprecedented, really, and hasn't really been matched
He's
yet.
like Aristotle.
Absolutely. Well, but I would say that he is Aristotle in practice, because Aristotle didn't write an astrology text. He didn't draw maps.
No, but
he
did
created
write on the sky, though, I think.
what? He wrote
Aristotle did some
on the
stuff
heavens, yeah, and there's a little bit of astronomy, but it's not. It's still more philosophical. I mean, the Almagest is incredibly detailed and didactic. The Tetrabiblos is very detailed and didactic. The philosophy is underlying everything, but I mean, the way that he goes through and is very sort of logical and rational and detailed. I think detailed is maybe a different way to sort of put it. And so Ptolemy kind of takes philosophy and really kind of puts it into a new category. I mean, I wouldn't even call this natural philosophy. This is science. This is like the birth of science, really, And astrology was there at that birth of science, and it was part of it, and a critical part of it. And the fact that meteorology is sort of weaved into here too also indicates some sort of, I think, global. The fact that he starts with mundane astrology and the fact that he includes sort of meteorology, to me, just shows how much we lose when we only look at astrology from a sort of natal chart perspective, because it was always meant to address global issues, to address the planet and things like that. And that is something that maybe we can kind of remember from reading the Tetrabiblos, and also that seeking of harmony that we have in Aristotle and whatnot would be perhaps really useful at a time like right now for us to kind of re-engage with that sense and observation, where are the birds? Like, there's a problem, there's a system that's out of balance. How do we fix that, And
I think, I mean, people find harmony boring.
yeah,
That's kind of an issue. They don't want harmony. They want drama. They want worst to happen.
another wonderful thing that the Greeks left us. But yeah, well, and I would say that Ptolemy is definitely kind of coming out of that too, because the drama of the sort of high sort of Greco-Roman period was gone by the time Ptolemy. I mean, long gone, multiple centuries gone. It was still a very vibrant culture, but the intellectual elite were trying to separate themselves from that drama, from that mythos, and they were really kind of like trying to step out like into a more sort of equally, I think, numinous, but more realistic, pragmatic, down-to-earth sort of experience of life. And Ptolemy would have definitely been kind of like one of those first footsteps in that direction, at least as far as what we know. I mean, I'm sure he was not an isolated man. He was part of the community. He had teachers. Someone taught him something, like he didn't just randomly sort of exist. And so he would have been part of that, but thank God that he was able to kind of consolidate the information in the way that he did, because now we have it and we can kind of at least get some very tiny glimpse into this world that he would have been a part of.
Does he talk about Euclid?
He doesn't, no, but it has to all be in there, exactly. I mean,
Euclid was like him. He was sort of doing a mop-up on all the knowledge of the time.
yeah, well, and he I don't know where it is, but in book 1 he goes through somewhere in there is the aspect doctrine that we all come to know and love.
Yeah.
Like that's where it starts. The tropical sidereal zodiac issue, all right here. Like started. He wasn't not aware of this, and he really kind of shifted the Western tradition in the direction that it is, where it focuses on the tropical zodiac it's so sad because I really I want him to be alive now to tell us what sense to make of it.
Yeah.
You know, because he doesn't. He just says, I mean, you know, his argument for the tropical sidereal zodiac is very practical. Again, it's just sort of like, you know, this is where the sun rises, and so this is where the sun rises when it comes back around on the vernal equinox, when everything is aligned perfectly and we are right at distance from the sun, blah, 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 blah. And so, of course, that's where you start, you know, and he even says, like, it's a circle. How do you know where to start in a circle? You could start here, you could start here, but we're going to start here. And he really kind of just names that and makes that decision. And that was another one of the decisions that Ptolemy made that I think carried astrology through, but then also potentially came to aid in its demise, because now we have that whole issue of the planet, or the stars are no longer aligned with the zodiac,
Yeah.
and so
But
basically
it's
no
what you're
astrologers
saying.
know what they're talking about.
He brought astrology down to earth. He brought the stuff down.
Oh, hi, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. And so the tropical is more of a down to
Exactly.
earth.
It is. It's fully
Yeah.
based in the experience of being a person, just like the geocentric cosmos that he kind of outlined. And there's, you know, like I one of the potential for the Earth to have not been a stationary center did exist, you know, prior to Copernicus. Copernicus wasn't the first person to ever think that thought, but it was so counterintuitive and unnecessary to our experience that it was so much easier to just say, we're at the center, this is what we experience, we're going to make a conscious decision to kind of live with that. And, you know, when the sun rises, that's 0 Aries, and that's a conscious decision that we're going to stick with because our experience confirms it, and that's sort of what matters, I guess. But yeah, so I don't want to even start moving into the next book, but I'm going to be here next week, or not next week, 2 Tuesdays from now, and I'm going to do the other one just the same, and maybe I can get even more people to come in, but if you guys want to come back, and then we can talk about book 3. And if any of you want to actually like read it too, if you haven't read it, you can let me know, and I can send you PDF or whatever of the book if you want to see it. And I think that was all I wanted to talk about with, I mean, that's not true. There's so much to talk about, but I think that that's all that I really insisted on touching on. Do you guys have any questions before we sort of are free and part, or any requests or generalized conjunctio sort of material too?
So what you were talking about, the lunar eclipses, Tommy's take on it is that when a lunar eclipse is occurring,
Any eclipse, solar or lunar, but yeah.
solar or whenever a solar conjunction is occurring, that the planets that basically all the elements that are in harmony with that eclipse are going to be, if they're resonant with an individual's chart in all of those elements, that individual is somehow going to be particularly in resonance with that.
Yes, or affected by it, and the way that you would determine what effects it was going to have. So basically what you're looking for is the eclipse rising in a city of choice, and you would determine which city of choice based on cosmic sympathies. So if the eclipse is happening in Libra, you would look for major cities within a Libra governed country. And then once the eclipse is rising, you would have that chart for that moment. And then you can look at the chart and then determine, oh, okay, well, so it has Mars conjunct Saturn squaring the ascendant, or squaring that eclipse. And so this particular region is gonna, but then also, if those angles sort of match the angles of an individual, then that individual is also going to have similar sort of experiences based on whether it's Jupiter, in which case they're gonna have great, wonderful things happen to them, or if it's Mars, then they're gonna have chaos happen to them. And so, yeah, in the moment, if you have a sort of matching birth chart, it draws you in regardless of where you are. So one of the other things about his interpretation of eclipses is that you have to be visible. Like it has to be happening in the part of the world where you can see it. And where it is affecting you, because there would have been some sort of relationship to the observational presence of it. If it's not observed, it's not happening technically. And so that's one of the main things. But if you have it within you, or if the founder of the city or the foundation chart of the city has it, then that would mitigate that necessity of it being present, like overhead or whatever. Yeah, did that answer your question? Do you have more of a question? Okay.
So back then, observation, they thought of the eyes as working differently. Like I think stuff came out of your eyes,
Right, well, I
like the
think that was
optics back then.
I think that was a medieval perspective. I'm not sure.
I think Aristotle too.
You think Aristotle too? Yeah, okay.
So I bet that his idea of observation was more like, when you look at something, it's not necessarily coming into you.
Yeah.
Somehow you're going out to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's like, and it relates more to what we think of as magic probably. That
definitely.
you can send things out of your eyes.
Yeah, and then in some way have some sort of connection with that thing or that person or that object or that plant or whatever it is,
Yeah.
and that there's some sort of mutual relationship that ends up happening that enlivens the environment around it. And yeah, I mean, totally. I think that, yeah, the way that we have come to learn optics is so cool.
Yeah.
But-
Like, so that would be significant, kind of as a background foreground thing.
Yeah.
For how this guy really thinks.
Right, yeah,
Like I was looking at some Sufi book the other day, and they were talking about the solar plexus is being receptive and the heart is being giving out. So it's like this, and so like we think of the eyes as coming in, but I mean I think they thought of them as going out. So you can imagine all these different functionalities in the body as changing their piston activity.
Right. Yeah.
Different stuff.
I like that. I really like it because then that again invites us into that sort of concept of participation, and that nothing is happening to us. Like we are both happening to it and it's happening to us, and we're meeting somewhere in this like weird middle place of being a human, and like how awesome is that? And that definitely is how he that is how he assumes the world to be in order to even begin to write what he's writing. And I think that is the fact that it could be in the eyes, and the need for observation, especially with light and stars, is like so appropriate,
Because Plotinus said that thing of like you can't see a star unless your eyes are like stars.
Yeah.
I mean, we are stars.
Yeah. I like that. Thanks you guys for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'll send out more sort of information, and again, if anybody is interested in having anything to do with Conjunctio, let me know. But also, if you guys have any like requests, like, hey, I really liked it when this happened, like send an email, and then that helps us sort of move forward and create like a functioning group again that can kind of have some juju behind it.
You're gonna do this in 2 weeks, you said?
2 weeks, yeah, 2 weeks. I'll send out another invite, and then I'll do book 3 and maybe the conclusion. We'll see. Yeah, if more people show up, then it takes longer to get through the material, but then of course it's extended, which is not a problem. Kind of an awesome thing to have happen too. So.
Is this the course, or are you teaching?
So I teach the course online, but I was working in my home office, and I got really tired of trying to teach class on the computer. That's not how I function. I need like humans, and I need a chalkboard. Like I can't just sit and stare into a screen and feel like I'm giving a decent lecture. So I needed to get out of my home office. And so I'm sort of in this transition phase where I don't know what I'm gonna do moving forward for the rest of the course. It's supposed to be a year-long course. I'm through half of the first semester, so to say. And so I'm thinking it'll probably end up just happening here all the time, and it'll always be open, just like everything else.
So in other words, is this being sent out online?
Yeah.
This is the class?
This is one of them, yes, one of 5.
Oh,
5 on just Ptolemy, and then there were 5 on Manilius, and then there will be 5 on Pretorius that'll start after Ptolemy's done.
Are these classes associated with the school?
It's my own project that I decided to create. After doing everything that I was doing with Conjunctio, I realized like I knew what I wanted to do, which is I wanted to teach this stuff.
Yeah.
I knew I wanted to teach, and I knew that I couldn't wait 3 years until I have my doctorate to actually teach it. And so I was like, I'm gonna just figure this out right now, And so I kind of created the class, and it's been going great. But it's also like a weird thing to realize that like a lot of the people who are interested are non-local, and so then I'm kind of teaching for a non-local group, but I want to really kind of put some energy into maintaining some sort of local complement as well.
How about period dress?
Yes.
Like when you're teaching this stuff, you wear a toga.
No.
Different tourniquets, some fancy.
That would be good. Well, so like I mean, it's really cool. We're gonna read the one that I am the most excited about, which I think I'm also going to equally regret having chosen as a